What's going on, guys? Today we're going to talk about why I'm not a huge fan of either drop and drive or tall and fall as descriptors of elite lower half mechanics. But first, if you guys are new to this channel, I'm Ben Brewster, co-founder of Tread Athletics. We do both in-house and remote baseball player development coaching for thousands of high school, college, and professional pitchers. First off, here's why I'm not a fan of either drop and drive or tall and fall. Drop and drive, when I think of that general phrase, that general saying, I think there are some good things, but when I think of drop and drive, what I first think of is that initial move being down, being drop, and the drive being a push or an extension. So that's the very first thing I think of. I think of balance points, drop, extend. I think that's how a lot of players will interpret that cue. Again, some guys will interpret that and end up with elite mechanics throwing 95, 100 miles an hour, but I think in the majority, that doesn't do a very good job of describing what's actually going on. So again, not a fan of that because there's no initial weight shift happening if your first move is just to drop, and then the extension phase, the drive phase, a lot of players will misinterpret what that actually means. And again, when you get overly extended, you lose the ability to actually rotate and send that energy up the chain and actually get any of that momentum and energy out and around into the arm and ultimately into the ball. Wasted energy, wasted effort when guys adopt that pushing, extension dominant back leg. When it comes to tall and fall, it's almost the opposite. So as opposed to having an overactive, overengaged back leg that's pushing and extending, what you have is basically an underactive back leg where guys will just lift and fall. Tall and fall, to me, indicates zero back leg involvement, zero tension, really no like loading action in the back leg, just lift and fall. I think of somebody like Tyler Glasnow when he was in the minor leagues and he was throwing 5-6 miles an hour slower than he is currently before he threw 100 miles an hour, and really just no back leg involvement, just falling. So this typically goes hand in hand with guys that come to a balance point and they kind of just reach the hips forward and fall. What should we do instead? If we're not going to do tall and fall, not drop and drive, again, knowing those are cues that will be interpreted differently by every different player that hears them. Some players will interpret that and they will have very high quality, efficient mechanics. Others, that's where their concern lies, where guys will misinterpret what they're trying to do with their lower half mechanics and ultimately end up underachieving as players as a result. So what should we do instead? Now, it's not as catchy, but I think it does a better job actually describing what's going on. So there's 4 parts when it comes to the lower half mechanics. We're not going to get into the upper half mechanics, but from lower half mechanics, there's 4 parts. There's the drift phase, there's the hinge and linear move phase, drift, hinge, linear move, and then there's the rotate phase, rotating into landing, and then there's the block phase into ball release. So from landing into ball release, where that lead leg extends. So let's break that down one piece at a time and talk about, from a physics standpoint and a conceptual standpoint, why this is important for the most efficient hard throwing pitchers in the world, and then also a couple cues on what it should typically feel like. A disclaimer here is that not every single successful pro pitcher, Hall of Fame pitcher will necessarily do every single one of these phases perfectly, right? You can have guys that don't do a great job drifting, but rotate really well. Or they don't do a great job rotating really well, but they block really well. Or they drift really well, but they don't do a good job actually catching the hinge or have a great linear move. And so there's all sorts of ways to compensate with levers, with athleticism, with strength, and different parts in the delivery. So this is not a set of hard and fast rules. This is just studying thousands of the most efficient pitchers in the world. What are the general principles that the vast majority of them stick to? And it's a framework for identifying and understanding mechanics. So that being said, let's start with the drift phase. Well, the problem with a balance point is that typically when guys come to a balance point and they do all these sorts of drills, the very next move is to reach the hips forward. And so what happens when you reach the hips forward from a balance point is you actually lose that stack position between the pelvis and between the torso. And so as you come to a balance point, the very next move tends to be reaching the hips forward. At that point, we've given up all the available range of motion in that back hip. So we have a certain amount of range in this back hip, call it 30 degrees. This is called hip abduction, abduction. If we tip our hips forward, we have given up effectively all the range that we have in that back hip before we've even moved anywhere. So from here, what can you do? You can fall. And so you can either fall or you can fall and then last second try to jump using your quad. But as far as at the hip, you're not going to be able to rotate well, and you're either going to get that range of motion from the quad, from the knee, from jumping and extending, or you're just going to fall down the mountain. So balance points typically don't work as well because most guys will go from the balance point into that reaching move with the hip. So the drift is a subtle move. The drift is just getting the center of mass going forward. It's a very subtle move. And again, you might have like a Nolan Ryan, big leg lift. You might have a Clayton Kershaw where he's just subtle drift and then go, It's gonna look different depending on the guy, but the idea is just getting the center of mass going forward ever so slightly. And what this does is actually you save up that range of motion in your back hip until you've actually shifted your weight forward away from the rubber. So right here, my weight is completely over my back foot. I haven't shifted at all. When I get my weight out front, now when I actually get into my lower half and I drop and I find tension, it actually accelerates you forward. When you just stay back here and you drop, you don't go anywhere. And so it's really important to have that very subtle forward move so that when you drop, everything accelerates forward and you actually create a more lateral force vector that sends you towards the target. As far as what to feel with the drift, this is a very subtle move. And so I like to coach it with step back throws so that you can actually feel yourself getting out front without losing the backside. So if you feel like you're just lifting and you're completely losing your backside, you just feel like you're falling, you're doing too much. It's a very subtle move. So that's the drift. It gets everything going forward. The next phase of this is the hinge or the linear move phase. And so you've gotten everything going forward, you've gotten your center of mass shifted forward a couple inches. The next phase is making sure you haven't actually lost the back leg. So you still have that stable back foot position, you still have that stable back leg, stable ground anchor, and good posture. So you still have your torso over top of your pelvis as you shift it. From here, we're actually gonna find tension in the backside. Now, why tension? If you can load and wind rotational tension through the back hip, now we have created that three-dimensional stability to the ground. Now we actually have something that we can unload from our pelvis. If you never actually create any sort of tension here, your pelvis is essentially just like in no man's land as far as being able to actually produce power out of a stable position. It's kind of like the saying, you can't shoot a cannon out of a canoe. We're trying to actually get that canoe to be anchored to something. And so we want this foot to be stable and we want to be wound up in that stable point of tension, riding it down the mound as long as we can with a stacked torso and pelvic posture. From here, now we actually have something stable to rotate out of. If this leg is just back here, there's no real stability. You're in your quad. You don't have the same stability to rotate out of. A couple helpful cues when it comes to the hinge or the linear move. One, we've already talked about how we don't want to be overactive with the back leg. So it's not about putting as much force as you can into the ground, jumping off the rubber. It's more about finding that point of tension and riding it forward. Once you found it, it's just riding it forward, riding the pelvis in that closed sack position forward as long as you can. But it's not this aggressive, how much force can I put into the rubber type move. It's finding that point of tension and it's riding it. Guys who don't have as much range of motion in the back hip, as they load tension, right, they might end up, that's the extent of the range of motion they have. And so they're gonna end up in a little bit more of a vertical shin position because of their range of motion that they have, they're out of range right there. Somebody like myself with more hip internal rotation, that range is gonna represent potentially a more lateral shin angle or more coil over the backside. So it's gonna look different depending on your body structure, depending on your mechanics. The next phase is the rotate phase. I like to think of this more as relaxing the hips into landing, relaxing the hips into rotation. But the rotate phase is extremely crucial because we've shifted the center of mass, we've built linear momentum towards the target, but we have to figure out how to get this linear momentum and actually get that out and around into the ball. How do we get that into the arm and get that into the baseball? The answer is through rotation. We're not just gonna jump linearly and just crash forward. We need to somehow convert that into rotation so that that energy can funnel up the chain. Think of it like a tornado from the ground up. So we're taking this linear move, we need to somehow convert that into rotation. Convert it into angular momentum from linear momentum. How do we do that? We do that from having wound tension, so you actually have something stable to rotate out of. Just before landing, again, you watch what the hardest throwers in the world do, the most efficient throwers in the world do. They're closed off relatively late into the delivery, but by landing, they've allowed the hips to relax and pop open into landing. And so that rotation typically is somewhere around 45 degrees. The hips aren't landing completely open. They're not landing closed. They're popping open at the last second, somewhere around 45 degrees, give or take. I used to think that to rotate was to aggressively spin my hips as hard as I possibly could, and that would help me throw harder. But if you, again, look at what the hardest throwers do, it's a smooth, fluid unwinding. It's not an aggressive, forced, muscled move from the hips. And so after I'd gone through a number of back injuries and slowly figured this out, I realized it was way more of just relaxing the hips into landing. So drift, ride tension, pop the hips open. And because that's more of a relaxed move, now it doesn't bring the torso with it. If you try to fire everything at once, it brings the torso with it. If you're able to relax, now you can actually let the hips come. Because this is relaxed, the shoulders stay back. Now you can actively fire the torso and be able to generate that separation. Now you can create that slingshot effect. So the rotate phase, extremely important. I typically will recommend guys think of relaxing the hips into landing, not powering the hips into landing. And the fourth phase is the block phase. Now the block phase will happen automatically if you've done everything else right to that point. I'm not a huge fan of consciously teaching guys to try to force that block to happen, because this block is not happening as a result of firing the quad. This block is actually happening as a result of you've landed, so you now have a firm anchor into the ground. The hips are 45 degrees open, you've relaxed properly, so the shoulders are able to stay closed, the torso is able to stay closed. Now, as the hips rotate into that stable ground anchor, watch what this side of the pelvis does. As it rotates, this pelvis is fixed to this end of my femur, my leg bone here. So as this rotates, it actually pulls on the femur. It pulls, again, fixed point, pelvis is rotating, and it pulls that leg into extension. And so the block actually happens automatically as a result of completing that rotation over your front side, not as a result of actively pushing or contracting the quad. So again, I'm not a fan of all those drills where guys are trying to force the lead leg block this way, because it happens automatically if you just rotate. If you rotate, that lead leg will extend automatically as a byproduct. So I know I've thrown a lot at you guys in this video, but actually getting into some of the drills and other cues and how to work on these things, it's a little beyond the scope of this video, but we've done tons of videos on this channel talking about how to work on the drift, different drills for the hinge, different drills to work on rotation and the blocking phase. So if you're interested, we'll drop the links to some of those videos down below. If you guys enjoyed this video, go ahead, subscribe to this channel, give us a thumbs up, and drop a comment down below if you have suggestions for future videos. Hopefully you guys took something away from this video, and I'll see you next time. Thanks again.